Welcome to this course on DevOps and ITIL. My name is David Tessar. I am a senior technical evangelist here at Microsoft, and I am focused on DevOps. Who else is here?
And my name is Nathan Lesnowski. I'm an architect with Concurrency, and I'm here to talk a lot about DevOps and ITIL and how they fit together.
Cool.
All right. So, as an introduction to this course, what we want to encourage you to do is to take a step back. Take a step back in the way that you look at your IT organization and how you deliver on IT within the business. We want you to take a step back and look at the way you deliver IT in a totally different way, in a way that's going to enable you to be more agile and to deliver more value in a shorter amount of time. We want you to put on practical service improvement glasses. When you look at your IT organization, we want you to look at it in a way where you're opening up the book and you're saying, here's the things that we do really well, and here's the practices that the business knows us for, and here's the areas that the business is asking us to improve. We want you to take away some new ideas. And as we present this to you, as we engage in this conversation, we really want you to understand about how your traditional IT practices fit into what we would call modern IT practices, really combining your traditional enterprise or traditional service provider practices with this DevOps kind of world, and how these two things are really complementary in the way that we execute on them.
They can be complementary, but they might not be, right? Depending on how that's executed, but that's what I'm sure you're going to tell us all about today, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So as we look at our agenda, we're going to start off with an understanding of what modern IT really is. What are we really talking about, and how do these things fit together? We're going to talk about ITIL, where it traditionally is sat, and how it's moved throughout and evolved in its life cycle. We're going to talk about DevOps. David's going to cover a lot of that, and then we're going to take DevOps and ITIL. We're going to combine them together to see how they can be complementary and where the hurdles can be when you're engaging in combining those two practices. All right. So, when I engage in organizations, one of the things I sometimes see is that IT is considered this black box. It's considered a black box in the sense that it's a cost center for the business. And IT used to be able to kind of survive being a black box. It was just scary enough that the business would just consider throwing money at it, and it was okay with that because it didn't really know exactly what was happening within IT. But what's happened is IT has kind of gone through this flexion point, and the business is desiring more transparency from IT. So if your business sees you as this black box where money goes in and they're not really sure what comes out, what this practice of using ITIL and using DevOps and combining these together is going to enable you to do is to become a transparent IT organization where the business is able to realize the value and see the value that it's bringing to the table, and also allows you to be able to function in a way where you're seen as a business asset.
Yeah, I know. For me, I've seen organizations who are treated in that way, and usually when that's the case, it's really a big shift for that company to get into DevOps mode, because at that point, when you're shifting to DevOps, a lot of things change, as you'll see throughout the course of the day here. But if you're fighting fires all the time and your business is just saying we're throwing money at you, that's not where you want to be, right? And so we're here to help show you some ways to help change that throughout the course of the day. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the ways that we're going to encourage you to change your IT organization is by looking at it as an IT service provider, a service provider that delivers services that the business consumes from you and consumes in a way where they understand and realize that value. And then DevOps looks to then accelerate the way in which you're then delivering that value to your customers. So it's divided up into a couple different things. If you were to think about a service that IT delivers to the business, think of it as anything that you deliver, anything that has value that the business understands from IT. One example might be customer ordering services, or for example, for us, we have a university application that we deliver to our customers. And around that application, you first had to decide that you wanted to do it, that it's a strategic goal that you wanted to deliver that application. You gathered requirements associated with that particular application. You consulted on the direction on what kind of technology you wanted to select. You actually went and built it and delivered it into operations. You operated it, and then you went through a continuous service delivery platform or program as to how you improve that service over time. When we look at becoming an IT service provider, we're taking all these things that IT does and we're dividing them up into these services that we deliver to the business, and then the business gains all this transparency around the life cycle of what we deliver to them and our rate at which we can engage the business in those services, and also allows us to engage our stakeholders in a much more complete way.
Yeah, and in the DevOps world, right, I mean, you care a lot about things, getting your application to your customer faster, getting feedback on a quicker loop, and that mechanism. As an IT service provider, right, you want to help accelerate that business, improve the automation, really make that pipeline go at a much faster rate back to your customers.
Absolutely. So what we're going to walk through now is an introduction to an existing framework that many of your organizations are already using today. It's called ITIL. What is ITIL? ITIL is a framework that originated in the United Kingdom, and its job is to enable us to be able to deliver consistent services to our business users. It's focused around the idea of quality and consistency around a service life cycle of what we deliver to our customers. It also includes continuous service improvement and how we take that service and we improve it over time through a feedback loop. It's also augmented by something you may have heard of as Microsoft Operations Framework, and I'm going to talk through some of the evolution of that over time. So one of the ways in which a lot of IT organizations have gained some understanding of ITIL is what was called the V2 incarnation. V2 was made up of what were called service management functions. The idea is that when I deliver a service to the business, there are different service management functions that I need to deliver for that service to be successful. It means I need to deliver incident management, which is kind of the way people have always thought about ITIL when they first got into it, kind of the idea of ticket tracking. Something's broken and I need to fix it. Incident management is really about remediating broken states of an application and bringing it back into operation so customers can use it successfully. We have service request management. It might be something that's a new request, some change that's coming in, some new request for modification that's normalized, such as a new user request or a modification to an application's reporting system. We have problem management, which is about root cause analysis, where you're taking something that's broken, and it may break on a recurring basis, and you may be able to remediate it on a recurring basis, but what you want to do is you want to take that incident and figure out what is actually the root cause of that incident. So, for example, I had a customer that their exchange system, they had an on-premise exchange system, and it would fail essentially every other Friday. And they find out that the host that it was on had a memory leak, and they needed to solve that by remediating the driver on that particular host. Well, once they remediated the problem, then the incident didn't occur again. So problem management is a very important part of the ITIL lifecycle. We have change management, which is about taking the operational system and protecting it from incoming change. That can be something that's very valuable if you have very poor testing algorithms, if you're receiving a lot of changes very quickly, if you have a culture within your IT organization where changes are being made whenever people feel like it. So change management in many ways has been a very successful way to improve availability within an IT organization, because a lot of the disasters that occur within the IT organization are not caused by hardware failure or software failure, but caused by human error. So change management's principal job is to allow for managing the introduction of change within the operational environment. Release management is about what is the actual process of taking the application that has a new build and deploying that into the operational environment. Those are typically paired with changes. So if I'm taking a change and a change window for my particular application, I may have one or more releases that are being delivered within that particular time frame. Configuration management is about taking the deployed configuration that I have out in my infrastructure, the applications that I'm running, and managing the correct configuration of those applications within the infrastructure. So saying, I've got this application deployed, these settings need to look like this. If these settings look like this, the application will be successful, it will run properly. If this application setting changes, then the application will fail. So configuration management in many ways is about understanding what I have deployed, what the inventory is that I have deployed, and whether or not it's configured properly. And then service level management is about taking my deployed service and understanding whether or not the deployed service is running against the service level agreement that I've agreed to with the business. The service level agreement is very, very important because it allows me to say, here's the expectations that I'm setting with you around when I'm going to change my application, when modifications will occur, how I'm going to make those changes, who's going to make those changes, and what you can expect as a customer. One thing you'll notice about these particular practices is they seem very siloed, right? They don't seem to have the cyclical nature in the sense of what they were set up. And ITIL v2 really didn't have that cyclical nature. So when Microsoft came up with the Microsoft Operations Framework, what they did is they built the cyclical nature for ITIL. They extended the framework to build the cyclical nature that when you deliver a service to your customers, it goes through these various phases. So when you look at ITIL v3, they took all those same functions and they fit them into the 5 different aspects of the service lifecycle. So you start with strategy, where you're deciding that you want to do something. You then move into design, where you decide to build the thing. You actually design the configuration of the thing that you're building. You actually then go into building it. You transition into production. You go to operate it. And then you move into continuous improvement, where you're bringing that back through the feedback loop. This change to a cyclical life cycle allows for ITIL to much better meld with what we're going to talk about in the DevOps world.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge point to realize too. I mean, is if you're stuck in the prior to V3 days of ITIL and your organization is just entrenched in a lot of those processes, you really are going to have a hard time trying to move to DevOps until you move to this newer way of looking at things with ITIL v3, right?
Exactly. When you look at the service lifecycle, you really should be asking yourself 5 questions. And these align to our service lifecycle elements. The first question is, how do I know what I deliver to the business? Do I know what I deliver to the business? One of the things I find in a lot of organizations is that they really haven't articulated the value they bring to the business customers, and they haven't really sat down and said, here's what I deliver, here's how I've aligned my resources appropriately to fit what the business is asking me to deliver. Design, how do I reconcile my choices? Do I have a component of my life cycle where I'm validating that I'm reconciling the choices that I've selected? Transition, how did my last deployment go? Was it automated? Was it manual? How do I enhance and how do I automate my deployment process to allow me to deliver in a more consistent way and allow me to deliver at a higher rate of change? For operations, do my customers know what to expect? So when I deliver an operations environment to my customers, when I'm operating this application, have I set expectations with them? Have I defined if I'm going to make a change and it's going to take the application down or it's going to modify an aspect of the application? Have I discerned how I need to communicate that to my users, whether it's training materials or it's a notification that I have a modification happening to the system? And then also, do we check? How do we continuously improve my application? Do I endlessly have a V1, or am I setting expectations around how I'm continuously improving the platform I've been working with? And now we're going to move into an introduction of DevOps, which David is going to walk through.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. So the first thing that I get is a lot of times people ask, what is DevOps? And this is actually a really hard question, believe it or not, to answer, because even amongst the industry leaders and the folks who started, I would say, DevOps or the DevOps movement, they have a hard time agreeing upon a 1 or 2 sentence definition. So what I like to say is the old elephant story here, where multiple people are blindfolded and they're all only able to feel one part of the elephant. And in this case, the elephant is DevOps. And so they all say different things, right? DevOps is development, operations, collaboration. Oh, it's just infrastructure as code. Or no, maybe it's automation. Or no, it's actually feature switches. Or maybe small deployments. Kanban, right? There's all kinds of things that people have as DevOps. And I'd be willing to bet that if you're inside of your organization, you say, what is DevOps? You would get answers all over the map. I think there's a little bit of that going on where when the word cloud came out, people are like, don't tell me cloud, right? There is a lot of weight behind DevOps. It is a little bit harder to define, I would almost argue, to a certain extent than cloud. But that being said, there is something that we can stick to. So if we, at a high level, what I like to go to is talk about some of the scenarios when you know that you're not doing DevOps. So one of those scenarios is this, right? On one hand side, you've got a developer who's got this application. There's this big wall of confusion. So developer goes away, and especially in a waterfall type organization, developer goes away, develops for 3 months, 6 months, maybe even a year, does a bunch of development work, and at some point they say, we're done. Operations guy on the other side, take this application and go deploy it into production. Well, that may be problematic, right? Especially you get war rooms, you get long deployments, you get lots of pain coming from that kind of scenario, right? This is a very siloed type organization, and Dev and Ops are kind of in two different worlds. And on one hand side, you have developers who are being pressured to say, I want more, from the business, more features quicker now. And the ops guys are saying, less change, more stability. We don't want all this stuff coming down our pipe. And so this is kind of a non-DevOps world. But what does DevOps actually mean? What does it look like in terms of how do we kind of try and define it? So if we take a look at this here at a very high level, DevOps is a three-stage conversation. It's first about people, and it's also about processes. And so right there, I think we should kind of pause for a minute, because ITIL helps a little bit with these things, right? The people and the process side of the house. And if you have, and we'll get into this more in the second module, but if you have processes blocking the way, or you have people in totally siloed different organizations, then this last point is not going to matter as much, because what you'll have is tools or products that are maybe super amazing, whether they're Microsoft or not, and the people in the process aren't working together. They're working on different tools, or there may be a change request that takes a month to get approved for anything to go to production, right? So these are all kinds of things that can kind of inhibit DevOps. But when you put all those three things together in a harmonious way, DevOps is you could say is about that. Now that's a super high level view of DevOps, but there is more. There is more. So this classic org chart again, it's kind of harping more on the people side. This is totally siloed organizations. They're working together in a very disconnected kind of way. In a DevOps world, right, you're going to have kind of that intersection there of where DevOps plays.
One of the things that I've found that complements this is that some organizations, let's just take two different sort of sizes of businesses. One sort of business that I've worked with in this space is a very large enterprise that has very, very mature IT service management practices. And they have very rigorous ways in which they deploy into production. And the way they perceived DevOps when they first engaged it was, that's just a thing that service providers do. That's just a thing that these small companies do because they can accelerate their practices. And what we were able to help them discover, and what they then realized the value of, is that even when you have some of these very rigorous practices, you can leverage DevOps to be able to accelerate those practices by leveraging the same strong process controls, but then using automation and using accelerated processes to be able to bring more value more quickly. And on the flip side, we've worked with the service provider type organizations, where one of the things we've sometimes experienced is they've grown up so quickly, their business has grown so quickly, that they've taken very immature practices where they've deployed many times a day, and they've done that without any kind of controls at all, and sometimes with little automation. But because they've tried to grow so fast, they haven't necessarily implemented the practices that enable them to be successful. So whether you're at this very agile side where you're growing too fast and you're trying to be able to implement that change very quickly, but you're finding that you have some quality controls in the extent to which you're deploying, and you need to solve that, DevOps and ITIL together create some of that merger and allow you to be able to implement it successfully by combining people, process, and products. On the enterprise side, you see the same kind of value.
Totally. So this slide is important to let you know about kind of the overall life cycle, because kind of talking back to how ITIL v3 starts to talk about a life cycle and a circle of a service, Microsoft has this. We used to call it, or ALM. We've been in the ALM space for a long time. DevOps is a forward progression, I'd say, beyond ALM. And no matter what company you are, you're going to have to go through all of these phases of software development. You're going to have to plan, right? What is it that you care about that you want to go and build? You have to figure that out. You're going to, at some point, then move from that phase to develop and test the application. And of course, you can't just live in a dev world. You have to release it into some form of production or release it to your customer. And then finally, last but not least, operate and learn from that environment that you're running. And the big point here as well is that all the business, developers, and operations should be involved in every single form of the lifecycle in a true DevOps world. Because in a lot of organizations, ops is seen as the guy who just does the operate part. And in a DevOps world, that cannot be the case. You really have to have both teams working together towards a shared goal throughout the entire process. So what we also have is, I guess, kind of that's the really, really short answer for DevOps, the very shortened version of that. And there's other resources that we have on MVA on the longer story, like DevOps for IT Pros, or aka.ms/DevOps Learn has a lot of DevOps courses. But I will switch over to you. So DevOps and ITIL, how does that merge together? What does that look like?
Awesome. Well, DevOps and ITIL do merge together. There's a practice for going about doing this, and if you do it well, the result is that you'll increase the speed and efficiency of your overall IT organization. You will find that you will be able to move, I'll just give you an example, you'll be able to move from taking a 2-week release process where every 2 weeks you did one release to where you're able to release every day and increase the quality, because instead of doing the testing of that release process manually, you're doing the testing of the release process through an automated means that's testing throughout the entire life cycle. And you're doing releases instead of handing off a manual where you've written down in a Word document how to actually go about doing the deployment. You've been able to actually automate the deployment process. So you eliminate both that step of documenting the deployment efforts on a reoccurring basis and the step of manually doing the deployments. So oftentimes within the combination of DevOps and ITIL, at each of these little touch points, that's just one example of a touch point, each of the examples of the touch points, you're able to significantly accelerate the process while maintaining the same benefits that ITIL is bringing to the table. However, if you mesh them poorly, what ends up happening is you create chaos within the IT organization that's running ITIL. So an example where companies have tried to do this and it's meshed poorly, they've tried to accelerate the release process, but because the testing of that release process was not very successful, they ended up causing a lot more outages within the operational environment. And then DevOps ultimately got a bad name within an IT organization until it was remediated. So you can find out that if you don't implement it within a consistent process and you don't have the right tools tied to it, oftentimes you're going to find that you can create chaos within an existing organization. Or the result might be that ITIL will drastically slow the DevOps effectiveness. So if you try to implement DevOps, but you try to use the same way in which you've implemented your change methodology to tie that into the way that you've implemented the DevOps methodology, what you'll find is that the reoccurring manual change efforts that occur within your IT organization are going to take all those automations that you built and all those practices to accelerate the release cycle, and it's going to drastically slow it down. So it comes with a little bit of reimagining that you're going to have to do within the enterprise IT organization as well as in the service provider organization about how you're successful merging these two together. So when you look at the combination of Microsoft DevOps and ITIL, you can take the same framework that David shows, the Microsoft DevOps framework, and what you can do is you can actually introduce those same concepts into the Microsoft DevOps framework. So you'll notice on the slide that I have, I've included the different aspects of the service lifecycle tied into the same aspects of the Microsoft DevOps framework. So for example, at the plan stage, you see service strategy and service design. At develop and test, you see service design. At release, you see service transition. At operate, you see service operations. And then at requirements gathering, you're right back in the continuous improvement cycle. So these two components do merge very closely together, and what we're going to do in this series is we're going to talk through each of the components of the service lifecycle and how DevOps ties into that service lifecycle to accelerate and improve the way we deliver the services to our customers.
So there is a little bit of a glue here that helps. Nathan's mentioned a number of things like automation, some other things like that are going to come up here as infrastructure as code, and there's things called DevOps practices is just what we're calling them. And these may be a lot of terms that you may have already been familiar with. Infrastructure as code may be one. Continuous integration, continuous deployment. A lot of these terms that are on the screen here, you may have already heard of. For instance, if you're in the operations world, you've probably already heard of availability monitoring, right? You probably already are aware of those things. Where DevOps practices kind of have a good blend here is that ITIL spells out certain things, but then these DevOps practices, when merged together, can provide a really great combination. For instance, if you use infrastructure as code to provision your resources, that could be a really helpful thing in terms of having a very faster change release process in your organization. Now, the 4 ones that I've highlighted there, you also notice have an overlapping terminology even in the ITIL world. Release management, capacity management, change management. These are things that ITIL already has a definition for. So in many ways, I think that ITIL and these DevOps practices can be very mutually beneficial, because ITIL has a lot of standards, a lot of knowledge that's been built up over time for some of those practices where there's an overlap, right? And instead of it being kind of an ad hoc, we just do what we want kind of thing, there's some methodology behind it. And organizations who are out there who are like, oh, we don't need ITIL, we don't need change management, we don't need all of these other things, it's like, well, if you're one of the analogies I like to give is if you're on a bullet train, you probably want to have some rails, right? Because if you're going to be deploying, for instance, multiple times a day, whether you like it or not, you're going to have some structure behind that machine. And so the combination of DevOps practices and ITIL can be a really powerful thing. Yeah. So. With that being said, there are also some tools and Microsoft products that are out there around these different phases. So in the Microsoft ecosystem, right, we've kind of broken out the typical lifecycle into more granular buckets, right? You're going to still have to have some form of source code repo. You're going to have to develop. You're going to have to build and test and deploy, have environments, monitor and learn, and at the bottom have some form of communication process, change management, logging on what's going on inside of your environment. There's no way we're going to go through all these, but this just gives you an idea of some of the different Microsoft technologies that are available for the different areas of the lifecycle that you have. Likewise, we also have a heterogeneous ecosystem, meaning that Microsoft integrates and has integration points with a lot of other open source technologies. Now, this by no means is the comprehensive list of every single open source technology that's out there. This slide would just be totally fill. But it is just some of the ones that we have integration points with Microsoft technologies. For instance, Chef and Puppet, right, have integrations where you can use their modules or recipes to provision directly to Azure. So I should point out that also that the points where we list these open source partners in this ecosystem here is the primary integration point. It is not the only place where you could use these particular technologies. You could use some of them for testing, for instance. But these are just the primary points where we have integration. And at Microsoft, we have a very open ecosystem. So a lot of the tools and technologies that we have, we support open source or not. So if you're a shop that has existing heavy investments in some particular open source software, well, you might want to take a look and see maybe for certain DevOps practices or areas where you may want to integrate other tools for that particular part of your practice. So what's next? What do we have next? What are we doing? What should people do next?
Well, first, consider your ecosystem and how it fits. So what you should really be looking at here is not just this sort of in a book knowledge sort of way or a conceptual sort of way. Really look at some of the things that we're talking about here from a service lifecycle standpoint, from how your organization has been currently delivering IT services to the business, and whether you're very structured or you're lacking structure, where you have tools for automated deployment or you're very manual, whether you have the ability to articulate your services to the business, or you're more like the IT black box. Take a look at your ecosystem and look in where some of those challenges exist and how you can improve them. Also consider people and process and how that ultimately fits into the picture. And then learn about culture in our next session. So in our next session, what we're going to do is say, well, big part of this is how we actually structure ourselves. A big part of this is how we organize our teams to be successful. A big part of it is how we engage our leadership to be able to help us be successful. So in our next session, we're going to dive into people, process, and culture and how that fits into the delivery of DevOps practices in conjunction with ITIL.
Last but not least, we want to make sure you're aware of a lot of other resources that Microsoft has to provide to you around DevOps. We have quite a few courses that are out there around the aka.ms/DevOps MVA. And we also have a lot of a homepage there at the top, aka.ms/DevOps, a lot of different resources there. And there's also Edge Show episodes. So about every month we do episodes focused on different products and tools and technologies from within Microsoft, usually with program managers or engineering, around how do you actually enable these different DevOps practices. So check that out and stay tuned for our next module.